Alright, this next section of lecture pertains to the film Matewan, which was about the West Virginia Coal Wars of the 1920s, or the lead up to them. After you've seen the movie, if you haven't seen it already, at the end the narrator says this was just the beginning of the coal mining wars, and indeed it was just the beginning. Now we're going to talk about what happened afterwards. First, a little background information. The union that the coal miners of Matewan formed a chapter of was the United Mine Workers of America, co-founded by John L. Lewis and Mother Jones. The Baldwin Felts Agency, that is referenced and serves as the bad guys, is a private detective agency much like the Pinkertons, also based in Chicago. Formed by one Baldwin and three Feltses. A couple of the Feltses wound up being killed in that big shootout in Matewan. Well, after those events, with the shootout in town there, the miners organized even further. By the way, this is a photograph of the real Sid Hatfield, Chief of Police of Matewan, and relative of the Hatfields and McCoys. So the miners continued organizing. There were explosions of railways and of railway cars. There were incidents of miners being beaten to death. And then several of the Baldwin Felts operatives showed up as reinforcements led to a big battle, the 3 days battle. Came in and arrested, came in and were in conflict with the miners. A lot of shooting occurred. Several miners were arrested without habeas corpus. Sid Hatfield, who had been brought up on charges for the incidents that occurred in the movie we just watched, was acquitted. However, as the narrator mentioned at the end of the movie, he, along with one of his deputies, Ed Chambers, were caught by Baldwin Felts agents as he was walking down the steps of the courthouse and shot, I believe it was 15 times. Well, all around West Virginia, miners came together and organized in protest against all these miners who had been arrested after the 3 days battle there with no charges. So a big protest march was called for, starting in Charleston and ending in Mingo County, which is where the movie took place, and where a lot of these other miners were in jail. So they started heading down, but they didn't make it quite to Mingo County. They made it to the neighboring county of Logan, a place called Blair Mountain, where they were intercepted by the police and private security, Baldwin Felts agents. That led to a week-long running fight. They say that you can still dig bullets out of the trees and buildings in the area. Ultimately, this fight involved 10,000 miners and about 3,000 police and strike breakers. The mining company used private planes, not just for reconnaissance, but to actually drop bombs and poison gas on the miners. Here's a photo of some miners, some lucky miners, showing off a dud bomb that didn't go off, that was dropped on them. Then federal troops were called in. Ultimately, in this fight, 50 to 100 miners were killed, and up to 30 people were killed on the other side. Final result was almost 1,000 miners arrested, many of them serving long jail terms as a result of this protracted incident. You've probably never heard about all this stuff before, but it's pretty dramatic, really, if you think about it. Thousands of people involved, large numbers of people being killed, pretty much lost to history. These events in West Virginia in the early 1920s were a big setback for coal miners organizing in southern Appalachia. And really it kind of broke the back of the union movement in that area for a long time, for about a decade. But about 10 years later, somebody else came along and tried it again. and that was in Fentress County, Tennessee, just a couple of counties over, where Jamestown is the county seat. There was a tiny little mining town called Wilder. Wilder is technically still there, but it's really just a spot in the road now. But back then it was one of those mining towns, just like in the movie. And in 1932 and 33, they formed a chapter of United Mine Workers of America and went on strike against the Fentress Coal and Coke Company. Why did they go on strike? Well, their wages had just been cut for the third time. This is 1932. It's the middle of the Depression. So having your wages cut was particularly damaging then. And the trajectory followed a very similar one to the events in West Virginia that we watched in the film. There were fires set. A railroad bridge was blown up. Mine owners said that the strikers did it. The strikers said the mine owners did it so they could blame it on them. Several people were wounded by gunfire on both sides, Union miners and replacement scab miners. And ultimately, the National Guard was called in. This was not just a local thing. This was something that people were aware of all around the country. The National Guard was called in. The people were living in tent cities because they'd been put out of their mining subsidized housing. The Red Cross sent food supplies to the striking miners. Unfortunately, the person in charge of the Red Cross in that area was related to the mine owner, so that food didn't go to the striking miners, it went to the replacement scab workers. So a lot of people volunteered, came into Fentress County to bring food to the miners. And one of them was this guy, Miles Horton. You got a picture of young Miles Horton, a picture of old Miles Horton right here. Miles Horton, from Tennessee, had attended seminary in the north and then come back to his home state and established a school in Monteagle, Tennessee, the Highlander Folk School, established in 1932, just before all this happened. His initial idea was that it was going to be a school to preserve Appalachian culture and crafts. Well, he was one of the people who volunteered to come to Fentress County with food and what have you, and he started getting involved. He started particularly writing editorials that were published around the country, bringing attention to what was going on, formed a close friendship with the head of the local union, a guy named Barney Graham. Horton was himself arrested by the National Guard. Here are some miners from Fentress County at that time. Barney Graham, the strike leader, was killed in April 1932, which resulted in the strike fizzling out. Graham was killed by a couple of Chicago operatives serving as security at the mine. He was shot in the back 10 times, and his skull was crushed. It was ruled self-defense. Anytime somebody gets shot in the back 10 times and has their skull crushed and it's self-defense, it's a little bit sketchy. Here's a photograph of Barney Frank's funeral. It attracted people from all around the country. Miles Horton said about the murder of his friend Barney Graham, "If I wasn't a radical before, I was one now." And indeed he was. When Miles Horton left from that Fentress mine strike and went back to his school's purpose and trajectory all changed. It really became a school, a place to train labor organizers for decades thereafter. In fact, by the 1950s, it was not just labor organizers, it was organizers in particular, including civil rights organizers, in the lead up to the Montgomery bus boycotts. A couple of people who attended classes at this school included Rosa Parks and the Reverend Martin Luther King. In fact, Horton was involved in some of the planning of the bus boycott. This is a billboard that was plastered all around the South in the early 1960s, showing King at the Highlander Folk School. Martin Luther King at the Communist Training School. Eventually, in the 1960s, by the way, the school was burned down. And it was rebuilt in a new location closer to Knoxville. It's still there. It's fascinating just how influential this incident in Fentress County wound up being, and the ripples that spread from it into the civil rights movement. And yet, if you're from this area, odds are you never heard about it, because they certainly don't talk about it in school. I never learned about it till I came to college. But it is very significant and a demonstration of the fact that the labor movement, labor organizing, is not something foreign to this region. A lot of people, people lost their lives, really, in their efforts to make some leeway in this area. Pete Seeger, whom you may or may not have heard of, but he's probably the most famous folk singer of the last century, or one of the most famous, he didn't write, but he recorded a couple of songs about Barney Graham, and I'm going to paste the links to them. One of them is called The Ballad of Barney Graham. It's considered one of his most important songs. It was written by Barney Graham's daughter. He also recorded a song called My Children Are Seven in Number, and we'll have a link to that one too. It includes a reference to Barney Graham of Fentress County. If you're from Fentress County and you've never heard of Barney Graham, you should have, and you should make sure other people do as well.